As I work to become a better cartoonist, I copy pages from great books. When it was published in 2014, This One Summer was heralded as an instant classic. It's written by Mariko Tamaki and drawn by her cousin, Jillian Tamaki, and it's more than earned all of the awards and accolades. But beyond that, it is a truly beloved novel with a huge emotional punch at its conclusion. I want to talk about why I think it's such an amazing work of art, but I want to begin by showing you my drawing and discussing some of the things that I learned in the process of making it. I work in Photoshop on a Wacom tablet, and I try to get my work as close as I can to the original, but you'll notice it's not a perfect copy. My lines are not nearly as detailed or as precise as Tamaki's. But the point of this exercise is to spend enough time with the image in order to really notice what's going on and to begin to understand some of the key storytelling decisions that the artist has made. Of course, if I could move my drawing about 1% closer to Tamaki's ability and style, I would love that too. Now, I chose a 2-page spread close to the middle of the book, which of course is normally an important turning point in the narrative. But before I get into discussing my drawing, I'm just going to back up a few pages within the novel to what I think is roughly the start of the scene in order to provide a little more context for what you are looking at. The main protagonist of our story is Rose, and every summer she travels with her family north to the fictional community of Owego. This is a real cultural phenomenon in Ontario. People who are normally professional classes or a bit more affluent, they escape the city in the summer and go enjoy the season beside a lake somewhere. And so Rose connects every year with her good friend Wendy, and they hang out going to the beach. Wendy's family is similarly of a kind of professional class. Now, Rose is still a kid, but she's about 5 minutes from puberty, whereas Wendy is a year and a half younger, something like that. So she's still very much a kid. At this point in the story, two very important points have been established. One is that this year the girls are getting into trouble a little bit. They've been secretly renting R-rated horror movies and watching them on the sly. And they were almost just caught watching a movie and were kicked out of the house. And two, they've increasingly been pulled into the gravitational orbit of some local teenagers. They're not really directly involved. They're more on the margins. They surreptitiously have been watching and observing and noticing some of these local teenage dramas playing themselves out. So the two friends have decided to wander down the road to explore an unknown area, which brings them right to this area where the locals live. And as you can see, it's not exactly a trailer park, but it's a kind of working class rural neighborhood. Small houses close together, fencing, and so on. I love the sketchy quality to her work. It's almost like she's working with a Conte crayon or a kind of rough media, like a rough watercolor pencil. It's like she's on the scene sketching the various details and textures of these houses and buildings and the trees and so on. There's an incredible sense of naturalism to her work, which is really rich. When we look at her characters, that is also true, but like a lot of cartoonists, she has, of course, simplified the faces in order to make them more readable. And in the cases of the mouths of her characters, she gives herself a lot of license. The mouths are typically more prone to distortion and exaggeration and are often less anatomically accurate when compared to the bodies of the characters. And I think her sense of naturalism combined with this kind of artistic license gives the work an incredible kind of emotional and psychological range. If we look at these 2 pages, they seem to be united together by a common theme. And even though it's a little awkward, I would call that theme something like an uncomfortable place. Because everything on these 2 pages reinforces the idea that the 2 girls are now in a really uncomfortable place, both physically and psychologically. The way there's dogs barking and a cat banging the trash and an old woman leering. If I were to assign a theme to the next 2-page spread, I would make it something like the messenger. for reasons I'll get to in just a second. So when we turn the page, we have this beautiful panel. I love this. We're standing behind the girls, looking with them into deep space to see what they see, which is this fawn, which has wandered out onto the road. And I love this next panel because it serves to really create the sense of how immediately immobilized and still the girls become. The way in which Tamaki cuts them off right at the chin so we can't even see their bodies. But because we're looking at them directly from the side, all of the architectural details around them are perfectly square or rectangular. Every line is either horizontal or vertical, which creates and reinforces this sense of real stability, of stillness. I think it's a really, really interesting choice. Of course, the fawn goes bounding off. I love this directional line that picks up with the curvature of the gesture of its body, and the girls race off in pursuit. What I love over these two pages is how Tamaki really furthers what we understand about the characters through their body language. Windy is like a ball of energy, right? Has this frenetic hair that's always all over the place, but she's kind of coiled up a little bit, a little reticent, clinging to Rose, a little bit more apprehensive. Whereas Rose kind of explodes into pursuit. She's like an elastic band or a wire. And Tamaki really has us focused on kind of a sensual level of detail here. The way in which, grass is brushing past legs as they haul it up the hillside in pursuit of the fawn. I don't want to suggest in any way that there's some kind of a religious overtone here or something, but you do have a literary trope in which an unexpected visitor, the fawn, is a kind of alien presence, a kind of spiritual being, if you will, that makes this momentary appearance and then disappears. And if it wasn't for their pursuit of this magical creature, they would never make their big discovery. And that brings us back to the 2-page spread that I copied. So we've returned to my drawing now, and I want to start with the first panel on the page in which the girls have just emerged over a ridge and made their big discovery. This is a really important panel, and I wanted to understand better how Tamaki conveys the power of this discovery. So in examining the composition, I found that the classic rule of thirds was deployed in order to organize the image. The rule of thirds is really common design knowledge, but if we were to divide the picture plane roughly into a 3x3 grid, we can see that the ground level roughly corresponds to the bottom third, whereas the trees and sky fill the other 2/3. This is a very classic proportional organization. But I also can't help but notice how Rose lines up really conspicuously on the first vertical line, facing into the other 2/3 of the picture. This really creates a sense of space opening up in front of her. And maybe most importantly, we can see how at key intersection points of the grid, it forms crosshairs on the two most important parts of the picture as far as the story is concerned. And that is Rose emerging through the clearing, and this grouping of a chair and fire pit and other elements, the ground zero of a kind of teenage base camp, which is presently abandoned but is just loaded with the presence of the teenagers who use it. So whether consciously or unconsciously, Tamaki has employed the rule of thirds in order to help organize a very complicated scene. But the scene isn't just about how it's moving the plot forward. It's about the profound emotional and psychological impacts on our protagonists. And I think Tamaki's done a few other things to really impart a sense of drama by how she alternates light and dark areas to create a kind of vortex around Rose. One way of doing this, I think, is by following the major directional lines of force in the image. We could start with this really obvious one of the tree that goes down the side, but we could also follow along the fallen tree trunk in the foreground. There's also one that I think follows along the top of the ridge. And I can also follow along the edges of shadows and pattern areas up through the trees this way, but I can likewise follow up on the other side going up this way. I know that there's a bit of subjectivity being deployed here, but it really feels to me that there is a dynamic aperture of overlapping diagonal lines that are closing and maybe pivoting around Rose in this moment of her revelation. Maybe another way of looking at it is to simply group together all of the really dense, patterned, and darkened areas, and we can see that what's left is this looping, dynamic, lit area in which Rose appears like an actor caught in a spotlight while entering stage right. Let's back out and look at the whole page now and think a little bit about point of view. So we've got 3 panels, or 3 beats, and starting with our large establishing shot, we are of course pulled way back in order to be able to take in the whole situation. I'd say that judging by the top of the styrofoam cooler and how the chairs line up, our eye level lines up somewhere along the middle of the page. In the second beat, or second panel, I love Tamaki's choice of a worm's eye view. So our eye level is right against the ground. We're actually looking up to the very underside of the chair, as though we're looking from the point of view of all the garbage and debris itself, watching as these girls enter into the clearing. This extreme angle is reinforced by the decision to cut off the top of Rose's head, which strikes me as a really bold choice, but it works really well. So for our third and final beat, we finally get to the reactions of the girls. For this, we have a close-up, and I'd say our eye line is the same as Rose's. And of course, we have a close-up so that we can register how the girls are reacting. Windy is totally disgusted, the way a good kid might respond to the disgusting behaviors of teenagers. But Rose has a very different response. So if we quickly scan the second page of the spread, we see how Rose really starts inspecting things closely. Again, she's like an elastic band, but this time she's folded up so she can get down close to inspect what looks like a sculpture made up of straws that have been shoved into the crevice in an old log, no doubt made by someone while they were high. And Rose looks like she has the studied concentration of an anthropologist working in the field. She's really interested in what she's finding. In the next beat, we have this vertical panel, a really beautiful still life of the forest floor, as though we're looking directly through Rose's eyes. And then we have this sequence where Windy is horrified that Rose has picked up an old flip-flop. She admonishes her and suggests that doing so might cause herpes. I love this tiny little non-sound effect. Rose is silently dropping the flip-flop, and Tamaki simply writes in the word drop. So over the course of these 2 pages, Tamaki is establishing the site, the physical space the girls have discovered, while simultaneously registering how the girls are responding to that site. When we consider how Tamaki has grouped or positioned all of the images of the girls, they are mostly arrayed around the outside edges of the spread, as though they are bracketing or corralling the site with their bodies. Now, the site is made up of a loose collection of stuff, an unholy merger of nature and culture, perhaps much like adolescence itself. And I think the heart of it is this beautiful vertical still life panel. I love how Tamaki anchors the composition with a kind of X shape, or maybe a star made up of overlapping pieces of debris. Otherwise, it would just look like a random bunch of garbage mixed in with the leaves and twigs of the forest floor. I also love how all of the identifiable stuff, the gum packet, and there's a beer can and a bottle, an old chapstick, all of these things head out of the frame, which really focuses us in a way on the swirling shadow of dark material of the forest floor that circulates between all these elements. These create gestures that actually head out beyond the edges of the panel into adjoining panels, as well as across the 2 pages. And this swirling mass of dark, dense gestural matter really serves to create a single coherent space, even though we are seeing it over several different moments and never in its entirety. I really think that this spread achieves a kind of beautiful transcendent state because it works both as a single image, a single artwork operating on our subconscious to create the sense of a single place while remaining perfectly readable as a sequence of individual moments unfolding in time. From this point, a really powerful moment occurs in the book, and I think this owes a lot to Mariko Tamaki's writing. Not just because of the acuity and nuance of her dialogue, but it's about her choice of moments and the situations that she puts her characters into that really reveals who they are. This campground is a kind of desecrated space. It's what in the grad seminar we refer to as a liminal or interstitial space, which is just a way of saying it's a kind of threshold, or maybe a kind of in-between place. And this strange environment mirrors the strangeness of their interior experience as they come up to the edge and peer over into the frightening world of adolescence and, of course, the adult world that lies beyond it. In this moment and place, the dynamic between the two girls is really laid bare. At first, Wendy is just really grossed out, and all of this is just further evidence of how stupid all these teenagers are. But Rose sees a kind of treasure. Symbolically, she even finds a gold coin in the garbage. It's just a tourist trinket. Because Rose is starting to realize that despite how frightening this new world is, those who enter into it gain new forms of knowledge. And with this comes power. Rose is increasingly beginning to play with powerful words and test the limits of her ability to criticize those around her, most painfully her mother. But standing at the edge of this precipice, Wendy is scared. She's not ready to cross over. She's vulnerable, and thankfully, Rose compassionately agrees to back away from that scary edge with her. What follows is this wordless sequence as Wendy leads Rose back to the shore of the lake. It's a beautiful sequence in which the kids are jumping over the rocks as the waves splash around them, and light and wind are animating the trees. They return to being girls just running and playing. And in the sequence, Rose overtakes Wendy as they are running past the grocery store, and she's enshrouded with darkness, as though an ominous force is closing in. And for a moment, we see what Rose sees as she's running past the store, which is one of those older teenagers, the one that Rose has a crush on. But we see him curled up with anxiety, because he's already entered that adult world of sex and responsibility and morality, and he's already burdened with real adult-sized problems. But thankfully, that's not Rose's world yet. Instead, Rose and Wendy are delivered into a moment of pure bliss. We have a full-page rush of elemental water and air, and then this beautiful 2-page spread. The girls have dived into the water, and we see them in multiple views swimming around. They're in a continuous state of joy, and they're free. Free in a way that only children can be free. The scene arguably continues from here, but Jillian repeatedly uses 2-page spreads to denote significant chapter breaks, so I'm going to stop right here. I'm not going to give up anything else about the book, only say that it masterfully brings all of its various narrative threads together in a dramatic conclusion that chokes me up every time. I mentioned at the beginning that Mariko and Jillian are cousins, and they always refer to themselves as co-creators or equals in their projects. Jillian Tamaki is an artist, an illustrator, and a teacher. She's done lots of different kinds of works, including children's books. She did an online comic called Super Mutant Magic Academy. That's a very successful graphic novel. And lots of illustrations for The New Yorker, The New York Times, and other publications. Mariko Tamaki's a really successful YA author. She's written lots of graphic novels, and she's been writing for the big comic companies Marvel and DC, including some of the biggest blue chip titles like She-Hulk, Supergirl, and now Wonder Woman. Interestingly, she began as a performance artist, and I remember her from back in the day in the 90s when she was part of a feminist body positivity avant-garde troupe called Pretty, Porky, and Pissed Off. I also mentioned that this book has won a lot of awards, and that includes an Eisner, a Governor General's Award, and it was the very first graphic novel to win the prestigious Caldecott Medal for Illustrated Children's Book from the American Library Association. In addition to that, it has the distinction of being the most banned book in the United States in 2016 because it was a young adult book that dared to allude to the sex lives of teenagers. Not depict them, just allude to them, and dared to use the word lesbian a couple of times. Their very first book, Skim, is also an amazing book, and at the time of this recording, they are apparently working on a new project together, which of course is hotly anticipated. Now, if you haven't found it already, I can't recommend the podcast Graphic Novel TK more highly. It's hosted by Allison Wilgus and Gina Gagliano, and together they systematically unpack every aspect of the production of a book, from drawing and editing through distribution and marketing, you name it. It's really amazing. I'm going to leave a link to that down in the notes, and I do hope I get to see you again.